Good afternoon, everyone. I am Jamie Williams, President of the Wilderness Society, and we are so thrilled to have you all joining us today for the third and final session of Public Lands, We the People. We have been so thrilled to co-host this series with the Aspen Institute to explore the powerful ways in which our public lands can contribute to solving the existential climate and nature crisis we are facing and the painful racial inequities that we are finally reckoning with as a country. Today, I'm really honored to be with an incredible panel of conservation leaders that we will be introducing soon after my opening to discuss how we can build on the great work of local communities in conserving a connected network of landscapes that taken together is so critical for supporting the extraordinary wildlife that we have and for sustaining the health of our communities. Now, before we begin, I want to acknowledge that in discussing U.S. public lands, we are talking about the homelands of Native people. We recognize Indigenous communities and cultures for the traditional and continuing stewards they are of these lands, and we honor their sovereignty. Now, we are all in different parts of the country. I'm speaking today from Washington, D.C., the traditional homelands of the Nacotchtank, Anacostans, Piscataway, and Pamunkey peoples. Now, this is an important theme that I will return to as we think about charting a new course for conserving public lands that builds on Indigenous stewardship, leadership, and rights. So let's first orient ourselves to the challenges and opportunities that we face. Our U.S. public lands comprise close to a third of this country. These are the mountains, the forests, the rivers, the natural spaces that are so central to the clean air that we breathe, the clean water that we drink, the habitat that wildlife need for their survival, and the places that we go for our own renewal, inspiration, and healing. Now, like so many, my love for the outdoors really began very locally in the city I grew up in, Tulsa, Oklahoma, in urban public land open spaces, and then expanded with camping trips further out with my family. And while I've come to appreciate the great national parks, wilderness areas, and wildlife refuges that we have in this country, what I did not realize is that actually the majority of our public lands is actually unprotected, the light green in this slide being unprotected and the dark green represented by parks and wilderness areas. And because of that, in addition to climate change and the many other threats that we face, these lands are open to accelerating oil and gas development, to mining, to unsustainable logging, particularly under this administration, where these threats have been accelerating at a rapid rate over these lands. And so what we really have is a fragmented, disconnected patch of protected islands that aren't even big enough to protect the wildlife that are there now, much less sustain them into the future as global warming is shifting the entire ranges of plant and wildlife communities alike and putting enormous stress on human communities as well. And it was really this recognition that led one of our most renowned biologists, E.O. Wilson, and other scientists to conclude that we've got to protect at least half Earth in big connected networks in ocean, on land, if we're truly going to sustain the diversity of life that we now have and stabilize the planet and prevent ecological collapse that's so critical to our own survival. And this has inspired a global movement to protect 30% of our land and waters by 2030, an effort that's been championed already here in the United States in Congress by the great Senator Tom Udall from the state of New Mexico, who we are so thrilled to have on our panel today. Now, the good news is that because of centuries of stewardship by Indigenous communities, and because of 150 years of public and private land protection, we have the building blocks in place to conserve a connected network of landscapes for the health of our community and for nature. integrating public, private, tribal lands, as well as integrating really important and good science that we have with local leadership values and knowledge. Now, this is precisely the kind of work that has been happening in the enormous Yellowstone to Yukon region for the past several decades. And we are thrilled to have Jody Hilty here with us on the panel today as the Chief Scientist and President of the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, who can speak to the challenges and opportunities of an effort at this kind of scale. But we can't realize a vision as big as 30 by 30 or a big connected network of landscapes without changing the policy and practice of conservation, which has to be built from the ground up, as it was here when 5 tribes came together in the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition to protect and now defend the sacred lands in and around the Bears Ears region of southeastern Utah. If there's one thing I have learned in conservation is that all conservation is local. That the best solutions, the most enduring and the most well-informed solutions are the ones that come from bringing diverse groups together locally, developing solutions together, built on a foundation of relationships and trust. Now, most of my work has been in Montana, where I had the incredible opportunity to work with many collaborative groups. And one thing that I want to highlight, I learned from the Blackfoot Challenge, a local community group led by local ranchers, is what they have called the 80-20 rule, that we work on the 80% we agree on and we leave the other 20% at the door with our guns. And it turns out what we can agree on is extraordinary, as I've learned in my work throughout the country, but just want to highlight the Rocky Mountain Front in Montana as an extraordinary example. Now, this is where the eastern front of the Northern Rockies dives into the Northern Great Plains, truly one of the richest wildlife regions in this country, supporting grassland birds like the long-billed curlew to apex predators like the grizzly bear. And I was inspired to work with and see the collaboration of local ranchers in really wanting to sustain this whole landscape where so many ranchers have placed their ranches into non-development agreements in a connected network of ranch lands that's critical for the economy of scale, for the ranching economy of that region, as well as for the wide-ranging wildlife that inhabit both private and public lands here. I've been also inspired by the incredible stewardship and leadership of the Blackfeet people. Of course, the Blackfeet were the original stewards of this entire landscape. They now have a reservation on the northern end of the Rocky Mountain Front, and they've been working hard to buy back their reservation, which tragically, so much of it was allotted off during a period of assimilation policy. They've been working to restore bison to the landscape, and they've been working vigorously to protect their most sacred lands, the source of their origin story, in the Badger II Medicine region, which is now managed by the U.S. Forest Service. Back in 1982, Secretary of the Interior James Watt leased this area without consulting the tribe to oil and gas. And it's taken 38 years now for the tribe, working vigorously, to claw back 47 oil and gas leases, the last of which was just cleared by a court about a month ago. And now Blackfeet leaders have been calling on Congress to permanently protect this sacred place as a cultural heritage area. And just last week, Senator John Tester introduced legislation to this effect. Now, this really leads me to my last and final point, which is that as we think about conserving U.S. public lands, we need to chart a new path forward, one that recognizes that these lands are parks and public lands. Like so much of the country, were stolen from indigenous communities who still have such strong ties to these lands and who we have so much to learn from in terms of the stewardship of these lands. And to that end, we are really honored to have Jim Eno on this panel today, a Zuni tribal leader, member and a conservation leader on the Colorado Plateau for multiple organizations. In closing, as we consider the existential and urgent crisis that we're in for both climate and nature and people, this is a time in which we need to reimagine our public lands for the powerful solution that they can be for the health of our communities, for the health of the land, and for the health of the planet. Now, with that, I would like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Ray Wynn Grant, who's going to moderate this discussion going forward. We're really excited to have Ray here. She is a large carnivore ecologist who has done groundbreaking research on carnivore wildlife interactions as well as pathways for connectivity, initially in Eastern Africa and Kenya and Tanzania with lions, then in the Western Great Basin with black bears, and then with grizzly bears in the Greater Yellowstone. She's currently a fellow with the National Geographic Society. And I will just say, for someone who delights in collaring grizzly bears and clearly someone who leads with courage, we are excited to have her here today. I'm sure she will challenge us to think beyond our boundaries. So Ray?
Thank you so much, Jamie. Thank you to everyone who has joined us this afternoon. You are, as you've just seen, we are going to have just such a tremendous panel discussion. Jamie already got our minds really sharp on many of these issues, and I am just tremendously looking forward to being able to moderate this panel. I'm just going to start first by introducing our panelists one at a time. They are incredibly esteemed new colleagues of mine. So I will spend a bit of time on their introductions, and then we will dive into questions. I've asked all of the panelists to respond to every question, and so I expect a very lively discussion. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists. I'll begin with Dr. Jody Hilty. Dr. Hilty is an internationally recognized wildlife corridor ecologist and conservationist with over 2 decades of experience managing large-scale conservation programs. Dr. Hilty is currently president and chief scientist of the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative. We also call it Y2Y, where she works to advance conservation by leading science and community-based collaborative conservation to protect and restore wildlife habitat connectivity throughout the Northern Rocky Mountains. Welcome, Dr. Jody Hilty. We also have with us today New Mexico Senator Tom Udall, who is carrying on his family's rich tradition of conservation leadership and currently serves as the ranking member of the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on the Interior and the Environment, vice chairman of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, and co-founder of the Congressional International Conservation Caucus. Since coming to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1999 and to the Senate in 2009, he has been one of Congress's most staunch defenders of our national parks and our public lands, which he understands protect the foundations of our cultural and ecological heritage and strong rural economies. We also have with us Jim Enote, who is a Zuni tribal member, the CEO of the Colorado Plateau Foundation, board member of the Trust for Mutual Understanding, and incoming board chair of the Grand Canyon Trust. Over the past 40 years, Jim's service includes natural resource, cultural resource, philanthropic, and art assignments locally, regionally, and around the world. And he is committed to protecting and advancing his own and other Native cultures. And finally, we've already had a warm introduction to Jamie Williams. We've just heard from him as our keynote speaker. He has been at the helm of the Wilderness Society since 2012. He was previously Director of Landscape Conservation for North America and Montana State Director with the Nature Conservancy, where he focused on helping key partners protect large landscapes through innovative private and public collaborations. welcome, please, to all of our wonderful, wonderful guests. And if we can bring them up, we will begin our panel momentarily. I am seeing faces pop up. Welcome, everybody. Thank you again for being here. I want to dive right in and really start with addressing public lands. So getting everyone's take on public lands. My distinct question to the panel: what are public lands and how are they serving natural and human communities now? And if you're able to, maybe touch on how do we see that changing going forward? Jody, I'd love to start with you.
Thank you, Ray. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. For me, public lands are the place that hold the greatest hope for nature conservation now and in the future. And I think we have to really actually reimagine the public lands that Jamie talked about that aren't yet protected. Some of those lands are still serving for nature conservation, and some of those lands are being degraded today by things like oil and gas exploration, mineral exploration, logging, and those kinds of activities. Some of those can be compatible, some of those can't. It depends on the scale and where they're at. I think what we need in the United States as a leader of the idea of conservation, having created one of the very first national parks, is we need to think about how, given the science that we now have, we have to think about how to do conservation at the scale that nature really needs, which is not isolated individual national parks. It's about connecting them so that ecological processes and wildlife like wolverines and grizzly bears and other animals that roam really widely actually have the room that they need now and in the future. And by doing that, we're also de facto conserving culturally important areas. We're conserving ecosystem services like water filtration, clean air, carbon storage, and many other things that benefit human communities as well. So I'll start there and pass it on to the next person.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jody. I would like to hear from Jim, and then we'll have Senator Udall speak. And Jamie, you can round out your views on public lands. And Jim, before you begin, we have you on mute.
Thank you, Ray. Well, much of these lands that we're calling public lands were acquired from foreign nations. Some were donated by states or private landowners, and well, a hell of a lot of private public lands were stolen from tribal nations. For a long time in the deep West, a lot of landowners and businesses see public lands as serving the needs of the people. And this idea of multiple use, I think, is a malign spin-off of manifest destiny. We do think that, of course, public lands are major sources of water for our communities and their habitat for wildlife, and important economic engines for neighboring communities through tourism and recreation. But in the short term, they are sometimes used for once only or one-time extractive purposes, such as the carbon-based energy industry. For tribal nations, public lands are still considered homelands, and they are places of identity, places of some of the world's original medicines, and certainly places of solace and inspiration for millions of people.
Thank you for sharing those thoughts. I think we're going to come back to quite a few of the concepts that you, Jim, and Jody touched on, and how those concepts intersect with each other in terms of being solutions oriented for the future. So I really look forward to that. Senator, please, if you don't mind sharing your thoughts, what are public lands for you?
Oh, okay. Yeah, am I there?
You're here, thank you.
Okay. And the speakers before me have done, I think, a wonderful job in terms of laying out the broad landscape, if I may say that, on public lands. they're so diverse, and they include things like our great landscapes and waterways, our most precious wildlife and ecosystems, our most cherished cultural sites, and historic places. And it's great to have Jim talk so passionately about how the original folks that were here, how connected they were and how much they still have that connection today. And all of that is a part of our public lands, down to our city parks and things like that. And our public lands serve us in countless ways. They nurture our spirit, they provide recreation, they safeguard our culture and our history, they sustain local economies. And what we need to be doing is protecting them because they protect us. And I see the way forward when we see these challenges in terms of ecosystems crashing and climate change closing in on us and wildlife disappearing and the sixth mass extinction upon us. We need to use these public lands in a sustainable way to guide us in the future. And so that's really the crux of what the 30 by 30 proposal, which was talked about, is a worldwide planetary movement. I've introduced the resolution in the Senate, but it's going to require all of us, tribes and cities and states and the federal government, private landowners, all working together to reach that 30 by 30 and then eventually look ahead to 2050 when the scientists are telling us that we've got some big goals ahead of us if we're going to save the planet.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you so much for those thoughts. And absolutely, we need to really fuse this public lands discussion into how they can be of service to 30 by 30 conservation goals. So you're getting a little ahead of me. That's my next question, but we're going to bring it right back because that's a huge point of discussion. So Jamie, we want to give you an opportunity to chime in on this question. What are public lands and how are they serving natural and human communities now? You've heard a lot from the fellow panelists, but what might you add?
I think what I would like to emphasize, so many great comments made already, is the public part of public lands and the democratic nature of our public lands, that really the promise of our public lands is to benefit all. We each deserve a right to clean air, clean water, to access to nature for our own health, and also to be have a seat at the table in making decisions about public lands. And yet we see such inequities in who has access to nature, who gets polluted from energy development on public lands, particularly and disproportionately Indigenous communities and communities of color, and how can we right those historic wrongs, obviously first and foremost with honoring the stewardship and leadership and rights of Indigenous communities. And then really moving from, I mean, one thing that people don't realize probably, because right now we have an energy dominance philosophy to our public lands, is that close to 25% of the carbon emissions in this country come from coal, oil, and gas and energy developed on our public lands. It's a huge, it's impacting disproportionately many communities right now locally, but also a huge source of our climate problem. So how can we begin to reimagine public lands as for community health and right the historic wrongs with the inequities that exist right now?
So important, thank you. And I really appreciate your ending with a question. You're ending with a challenge, I think, to our audience, to our larger conservation community, of how we can improve public lands so that they remain sustainable for the future. Right? We are solutions-oriented folks. That is our job, but also we need to continue this discussion and try new ways to really get to these goals. So thank you to all the panelists. And if anyone doesn't want to jump back in with another refrain, I think it's a perfect time for us to talk about public lands as they are now and maybe how we can build upon them, improve them, to meet 30 by 30 goals. And so I would love it. We don't have to go in the same order, but who would ever like to jump in first? My question is, what is the 30 by 30 goal and effort if you have a different articulation for it? Again, it's 30% of land under conservation by the year 2030. So we've got a decade to make that goal. It's a huge effort. And then I'm really curious, it's a global goal. So especially in the circles that I am in, when we talk about 30 by 30, it is for the entire planet. But how is it more nuanced at a US scale? Jamie, you showed that really amazing North America connectivity map that was flowing in your keynote. And so if we really just kind of confine this to the United States or to North America, how does 30 by 30 become more nuanced? And what are some of your ideas or things you'd like to see for it? So whoever would like to start us off for that, please go ahead.
Ray, I would like to say a few words on this. What we're facing, and we've talked about it already, is a biodiversity and extinction crisis of epic proportions. In the US, we lose a football field's worth of habitat every 30 seconds. We lost a quarter of the North American bird population over the last 50 years, 3 billion birds. And scientists tell us we must save at least 30% of our lands and 30% of our waters by 2030. And there's a very active effort to do this worldwide. I've introduced my 30 by 30 resolution to save nature to set the goal here at home so America can be a leader on this front. And we need to be strategic to identify the lands and waters that will be most effectively protect our biodiversity and our forest and other areas that will sequester carbon. And I think our goal really should be is carbon neutrality for our public lands. And as Jamie and others have mentioned, I think Jim also mentioned this, the dominance of oil and gas and energy have been major. So there's going to need to be some real changes there and some real challenges we need to face.
Thank you, Jim. I want to add on to that. The United States is one of 2 countries that hasn't ratified the Convention for Biological Diversity at the global level, along with Somalia, that I think didn't have a government to be able to ratify it. One of so a lot of this effort is really around this Convention for Biological Diversity, where the rest of the countries in the world are thinking about how to stop this global extinction crisis. Currently, with most countries in the world are working on getting to 17% protected areas by the end of 2020. But we know we need more, and we also know that we need the United States to engage as leaders. It turns out there have been polls taken of countries around the world, including the United States, and even in the United States, most citizens agree that somewhere around 50% of the land should be left for nature. So we need to let citizens actually guide this and really ensure that policy is managing both what nature needs and what people want. And I would add to that there are lots of ways to do this. We don't have to do it necessarily in our traditional protected area approach. That's a really important piece of it. We can look north to our Canadian neighbors who right now are pushing forward large protected areas that are Indigenous-led protected areas. So just in the Y-to-Y or Yellowstone to Yukon region, in about the last 6 months, we've had 3 significantly new protected areas that are Indigenous-led. That means that Indigenous communities whose traditional territories are in those regions are now stepping up to conserve their cultural heritage, including their natural resources. And I think that that's a really amazing way to go. It recognizes the wrongs of the past, and it acknowledges that local people can be part of the solution. So I'll leave it there and pass it on to someone else. Thank you.
Okay, well, not the 30 to 30 goal. I think what must fundamentally shift for US and continental scale conservation to be successful and relevant to communities, particularly Native communities, is to bring the idea of co-management front and center. At least, I think, at least 30% of the Earth's lands, waterways, and oceans were sustainably used by indigenous peoples only a few centuries ago. Today, Native peoples are really well equipped and well positioned to articulate and implement sound conservation science and include thousands of years of traditional knowledge gained by being the original stewards of much of the earth. Traditional knowledge is not traditional ecological knowledge or science. It is not subjugating our knowledge to an ethnoscience. It is another knowledge system altogether, and it must be included. Also, make no mistake, Native peoples want to be part of the economic benefits of conservation of nature as well. And at the table, not as only advisors to national or state governments, but as full-on collaborators, co-laborers, and co-elaborators. And I think where relevant and where prudent, I would like to see tribal nations given special allowances for specific cultural uses on public lands, and that tribal nations will assume management or collaborative management on certain public lands.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for those thoughts. And before we get to Jamie, I'm wondering if any of the panelists can chime in about whether some of Jim's suggestions are currently on the table for discussion in your circles that discuss 30 by 30 initiatives. And if no one has a response at this moment, please.
Ray, Ray, I think that what Jim is saying is very, very wise, and 30 by 30 should embrace and learn from indigenous land use. I don't have any doubt about that. I mean, science shows that indigenous peoples are often more effective conservation stewards compared to other communities. And we should listen to and learn from native land practices. Indigenous owned and managed lands and waters should be actively supported to help us achieve 30 by 30. And part of what Jim has talked about here is actually happening. In New Mexico, we have several conservation areas that are jointly managed with a federal land management agency and a tribe. And it's working out very effectively. But there are always issues that we need to work through going forward. I mean, one of the issues that happened with the pandemic on these lands was there was such an influx of people because people wanted to get in the outdoors, and it was impacting a tribe. And so we need to discuss those issues and deal with them in the future. But I think the idea of co-management, joint management, and really learning from the native wisdom that's out there is tremendously important.
And I would add to that, I think there are lots of examples all over the place, just in the Y2Y region, on the Wind River Reservation and on the Flathead Reservation. They developed some of the first tribal wilderness areas. When we look off reservation, we can look at the Nez Perce, who reintroduced wolves to Idaho using their treaty rights for wildlife. It wasn't on their reservation, it was in the larger region of Idaho. And they really showed leadership there because they cared deeply about having wolves in their traditional territory. Right now, I know Jamie mentioned a place called Badger 2 Medicine in Montana, just south of what is currently the Blackfeet Reservation. And there are a number of proposals on the table about different ways of co-management of those lands. So I think there's some good examples out there that we can build on and strengthen, as the senator said.
Yeah, I would just add that what I like about 30 by 30 is it gets us to think at the scale of the problem and with the urgency that we must have, and push us to think about systems change. And of course, the the first and most important one is what Jim's suggesting here, that we need to think about co-management of ancestral homelands on public land. And there's some great examples, but we really need legislation. It's actually very hard to do that right now with the law that we've got right now. There's initial efforts in Bears Ears, other places, but we really need some systemic changes to really allow for that kind of thing to occur in a more systems-wide basis along public lands. At the same time, I think we need to think differently about how we produce energy on public lands so that they're not contributing to the climate problem, which they significantly are now, with, as I mentioned earlier. And we really need to listen to communities and hear what they need to expand their efforts to protect private and public lands in an integrated way. I mean, thanks to Senator Udall and others, we've just had this great success with the passage of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Well, that came from, every county in America has benefited from that national fund for community-led work to conserve open space and parks. And now it's been permanently funded at $900 million a year. Well, that can help accelerate the efforts of communities. And then the final thing I just want to say is 30 by 30 really needs to be an inclusive goal. So, and we need to think differently about protected areas so that everyone, farmers, ranchers, indigenous communities, can be part of contributing to the solution here.
Thank you so much to everyone. If there aren't follow-ups, and I don't want to cut anyone off because this is such a rich conversation with so many great perspectives, I'll lead us to another question. Definitely a challenging one, but certainly, many of us are really aware of and coming to terms with the fact that the leadership in this country historically for environmental issues has been predominantly white. And often when it comes to public lands, as it's been noted in Jamie's talk and also by Jim, particularly violent and often quite filled with tragedy. And even today, we see incredible inequities in terms of leadership for the environment, for social movements, and just incredible inequity in power structures in this world. So understanding that racial equity and justice is very much interlinked with our conservation goals for the nation or for the continent. And also understanding that every one of us here on this panel is, although working as individuals, we often work with organizations or with, for the public in the senator's case. So this question is really about what your organization is doing. So how does racial equity play a role in how you see the future of conservation leadership? What have you or your organization committed to doing to build equitable futures for people of color in environmental leadership? And again, I want to leave enough room for what is being done, what is on the table for the future, and how it'll feed into goals. So in no particular order, would anyone feel comfortable chiming in first?
Ray, I'd like to say a few words on that one. First of all, I think we need to start, rather than starting with my organizations, but there's a good example there, but start with the impact that environmental issues, air and water, and the toxics in communities have had on communities of color, which have created the health disparity impacts and many of the serious health problems. Let's take one with asthma and bad air, and we're seeing a dramatic increase in asthma, and it's even more dramatic in communities of color. And so part of our effort here is to make sure that we don't have that happen anymore, and we treat communities of color like every other community in terms of making sure they're getting clean air, clean water, and they're not part of a toxic dump. But I think each organization, and you've really raised here the issue of organizations, my Senate office, what I've always strived for, and I did this with my House office too, is for that office to reflect New Mexico. And so we have a majority minority staff, which reflects the state of New Mexico. My Indian Affairs Committee staff is among the most diverse in the Senate. And I think it's really up to conservation organizations. They need to take account of the nation's history of systemic racism and set equity as a goal there. And I see that happening with a lot of our environmental organizations in terms of trying to reach out and understand what has happened and do a better job. As you know, the Congress created the Udall Foundation. We've had a real discussion in terms of what Black Lives Matter, how that applies to the foundation. So I'd be interested with our panelists, because they have such broad reach of how they're doing in terms of these kinds of goals and what are they seeing the challenges. If I can just add, Ray, sorry to add to you put a wonderful question out there, but it just add a little bit to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Well, I just want to say that I think this is the central question for the environmental community that, as you said, Ray, has been historically white. We've got to diversify ourselves and our leadership to be representative of the country if, in fact, we can help serve and support the communities who are fighting for their rights to clean water, air, and land. We really recognized about 4 to 5 years ago at the Wilderness Society, which is very much a historically white organization, how much work we actually have to do to become more diverse, more inclusive, and most importantly, to deliver equitable outcomes given the inequities of the past. So we have worked hard on changing and really hiring a more racially diverse staff, leadership, board. We've had a lot of progress on that front, still a lot more to make, but it really matters who's at the table for creating any solution. And this is so critical. Secondly, we've really worked to change our whole strategic plan and really our foundational documents, our mission statement, with equity really at the center, because our focus really is on public lands, and we want to work in ways that help public lands truly benefit all, but particularly communities who have not had equal access to the benefits of nature on public lands, and even worse, so many communities, as Senator Udall mentioned, communities of color, indigenous communities, who've been impacted by toxic pollution that has been developed on these lands. So equity to me is really not just about trying to work for conservation so everyone benefits, but it's really righting historic harm and really paying extra attention to supporting communities that have been impacted in the past, first and foremost, in how we think about our work. So it really means changing our work. And we've been working more in urban communities. We've been learning how to be a better partner to indigenous communities and other initiatives that I think will be really important to ultimately make us all more successful in supporting people on the ground.
I really agree with what both the previous folks have said. To me, the vision of Y2Y, of connecting and protecting the region so that both people and nature can thrive, can't be successful. We can't have thriving communities unless they are equitable communities, unless people feel safe in those communities and people feel that they actually can get to those communities and have the access. Within our organization, we've taken a long look at it. One of the things that we've really been working on is, since we have 74 traditional territories across the Y2Y region, is promoting leaders within the indigenous communities themselves. How can we promote and support them on their vision of their cultural heritage as related to conservation? And I think that that's a really important step, but I think the conservation communities have to go further. It's about not only hearing from people of color that are leaders and elevating them to the level that they deserve. It's also about making sure that we are developing future leaders that are not the white conservation community that it is today, but a diverse community that represents the rest of society. And that means really being intentional about things like hiring. It means being intentional about the culture of the organization, being an organization that can accept multiple points of view, multiple diverse cultures and people within the organization. We know from science that that actually improves the overall organization and makes it more effective. We know that we also have to create, we can't have, for example, free internships, right? Because then people who have the means to be able to do free internships sort of are advantaged. But rather we have to think about ways that we can provide livable internships for people who may be less advantaged and ensure that they have the same opportunities to rise through systems like Y2Y, so that someday maybe somebody that's a person of color is the leader of Y2Y. And that's when we'll know that we've reached success.
Thank you, Jody. Jim, would you like to add any thoughts?
Yeah, sure. Let me say first that, I am motivated by several things. And one of them goes way back. As a child, my mother and I encountered whites-only public restrooms. And as a young director of the Zuni Nation's Natural Resource Department, I was paired with what was then called the Soil Conservation Service, but I was paired with a SCS lead. And we were working together to create a watershed plan across federal lands, tribal lands, state lands. And every time I mentioned the SCS working with tribes as equals, the SCS lead would tell me, whatever. And that motivated me. Also, remembering that the Native peoples were pushed off of lands in order to create multiple use areas and idealized notions of the pristine and God's country. I'm not disparaging anybody's beliefs, but this is, again, a perspective. Well, I have been on the board of the Grand Canyon Trust for 20 years. It is a fantastic organization that is, I think, a bellwether and a beacon for bringing equity into the conservation discourse and action. I am currently the vice chair of the board, and in 2021, I will assume the board chair. It is not an opportunistic moment. It simply makes sense. I think that in order to solve the most complex problems facing our world, we will need the broadest spectrum of people and their talents. Conservation groups have boards and trustees, they make policy, and they monitor policy. And if your board and staff are not seeing or understanding equity in this work, the time is up. And for funders, because I am a funder also for the Colorado Plateau Foundation, but funders, you understand the value and righteousness of justice, equity, diversity, inclusion in the conservation movement. If conservation organizations as grantees are not measuring up to bring equity to the front line, the time is up. Other organizations understand and get it, and they should be the recipients of your resources to the fullest amount possible. I mean, look, it's sentiments aside, it just makes sense.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you so much. I am certainly not a panelist here, but I can't ever help but to jump in with my own opinions. I really want to thank everyone on the panel for taking on such a challenging question and a bit of an uncomfortable one for many folks. And I hope that our audience members have really soaked up so much of what's been said. I do want to highlight one thing, and that's that I believe every single one of our panelists at some point during this talk has mentioned that racial and ethnic diversity improves success for businesses, no matter what the business is, whether it's for the environment or for conservation or something else. And so I really want to kind of throw out this challenge, not necessarily to the panel, but to the conservation community, that perhaps a reconceived 30 by 30 goal is not about a percentage of land that is conserved, but it is about reaching racial and ethnic justice and equity as a tool for then improving conservation. Because if we're going to agree that racial and ethnic diversity is a solution for problems, including environmental problems, then perhaps I strongly feel, it's radical, but I strongly feel that that's a really great starting place in terms of 10-year goals. And we could all talk about this for so much longer. It's worth talking about for so much longer. We have a lot of buzz from our audience. We have a lot of questions from our audience rolling in. And I would really love to pose some of them to the group. So I'm just going to pull up a document now, just to make sure we still have time to get these audience questions. And so the first one I would love to throw out to Jody in particular, but anyone else is, welcome to join in. This is a very broad question, but one of our attendees wrote, is Canada's approach different from the United States? So Jody, I think you mentioned a couple ways that our neighbors to the north are doing conservation differently, especially when it comes to landscape connectivity. Do you mind detailing that a bit more?
Yeah, well, I mean, Y2Y is obviously, it's a transboundary effort, and we do have to function a little bit differently in Canada than we do in the US because there are differences. I think actually the biggest difference in Canada is that Canada went through a process of truth and reconciliation, and they actually apologized to their Indigenous communities for the wrongs that have been done to them and set forth a series of actions that all citizens, all businesses need to take to right that wrong. And in the world of conservation, that's about land, right? And traditional territories, and honoring that public lands and private lands sit on territories of Indigenous peoples. And so what we are seeing is the ability to really support Indigenous communities who don't want to see industrial development on particularly important parts of their territories. Now able to articulate that, move forward, get provincial or territorial and national support to create their own Indigenous conserved and protected areas. And I think that's a really exciting difference, and it's something that we in the US could certainly look north and learn from. Right now it is a large experiment. Like Jamie said, they don't necessarily have the laws and policies in place, and they're sort of learning by doing. So there's a lot of different ways that that's happening. And there's, again, a lot that we can take from essentially the experiment that's unrolling right now. So that's one example of a difference between working in the US and in Canada.
Thank you so much, Jody. Again, I don't want to remove anyone from commenting. Senator, did you want to comment on that?
No, I'll let you go to the next question so we move it along. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, the audience is really chiming in on a lot of things. So I want to get to them. This next question is primarily for Jamie, and then Senator Udall, if you'd like to chime in on this, that would be great. It's a clarifying question from an audience member because they picked up that someone on the panel described public lands are not necessarily protected. So this person wanted to know, are only national parks and wilderness areas considered protected? And what do we have on the table to improve that?
Okay, no, I mean, I guess what has been, it depends on what you call protected, but at least relative to that map, it has to do with conservation designations. So wilderness areas, national wildlife refuges, national parks, any piece of legislation that commits land to conservation, there's national recreation area, conservation areas. I think it includes conservation easements actually on private lands. But again, that's, you know, and there's a lot of special designations that span the gamut on the public lands, because there's a lot of locally developed, you know, there's a Rocky Mountain Front Heritage Area, for example. It doesn't fit any of these, but still counts towards protected. So where conservation is a core purpose, and the land's protected, you know, from major threats like development. But again, that's, you know, most public land is open for energy development and whatever uses, you know, become allowed there.
Yeah, just to add to what Jamie said, and I agree with him, and when he put up the map, you really realize there's an awful lot of public land that could help with this 30-30 effort. It isn't just like we're going out and taking private land. There's a lot of public land that could be missioned for 30-30. And I guess one of the principles that I put out there that I would just repeat is when it comes to these multiple use lands, which are the ones that Jim and Jamie and I think Jody also noted that we have very intensive energy usage, that if you started with a goal that would be a goal of carbon neutral on public lands, you would really be moving us in the right direction in terms of where we need to go on climate and where we need to go in terms of creating a planet that is going to be sustainable. And so that's what I think we need to be looking at. Ray, one other thing that in the comment that you made right at the end there, I think I just wanted a short little comment. You know, when you see what the pandemic has done is expose all these health disparities, injustices, systemic racism. And so some people say, you know, we need to get back to normal. Well, actually what the pandemic and all of these challenges have taught us is we need to get back to a new normal where we don't have those anymore. And that's what we ought to be striving for. But thank you, Ray, for your comments too.
And if you don't mind, I just want to say, you know, that so there's a global database on protected areas. There's a globally agreed definition. In the US, only about 12.5% of our lands are protected. We are falling behind. Bhutan is already at 53% protected areas, and they have designated corridors. We can do better as one of the most developed countries in the world.
Right on.
Absolutely, and I hope our back end team won't get upset with me for throwing one more question in there from the audience, and maybe just one of us can take this question so we don't go over time. But again, it was, you know, speaking to actually what Jody and Senator Udall and Jamie just spoke about. One of our audience members, and probably a number, noticed that in Jamie's keynote, he showed that really cool map, which had, you know, kind of moving, very beautiful flows of connectivity across North America. But there is a portion of the United States, especially the Midwestern United States, that did not seem to have that type of connectivity flow. And so the question asks, well, how do we connect through or to these landscapes? Given that there's likely some major river systems on those landscapes as well, including the Mississippi River. So I want to throw this to Jamie, but if someone else thinks that they have a quicker answer, please chime in.
Yeah, no, good question. I mean, that, you know, the whole country, I mean, the Midwest, I mean, even as fly over for birds, not fly over, but the Great Plains is really important for a lot of different reasons that don't show up well on that map. I noticed the same thing. And, you know, as you mentioned, rivers. So I think that map was, you know, one representation of what connectivity could look like for wildlife. I'm not sure. I don't think it was with birds, and it certainly, you know, doesn't capture the major river systems that are so core to all parts of the country. So it was really meant to be, one example and representation of the need to think, particularly in the world of climate change when everything is shifting, and how to build connections. And that can be done in the Midwest as well as the whole country.
Yeah, and from a science perspective, it's just that it is the most impaired and least protected system. So it is a system that needs restoration.
I think also that that part of the continent, there's a lot of private land, of course, and private ranch land and range land. But I can see sometime in the future, private landowners maybe donating to make some of those areas public lands. And I would like to see some patriotic pride in our landscapes and waters, and make public lands a national interest, a stronger position than only local interest. Local is important, obviously, for involvement, but I think around public lands, we need to sharpen the message, broaden the base, and mount a strong grassroots campaign to replace the idea of multiple use with public use and common property, to include protecting watersheds, protecting wildlife habitat, and allowing sensible recreation and protecting areas of our nation's foundational antiquity and identity. So public lands as public use and common property, like we generally do with water. I think also we must preserve Congress's authority to create and protect public lands, because I'm really concerned about lands protected primarily through executive action as being very much at risk. And so maybe it's for some people who are really on the other side of this, is that reframe the laws and reforms as structure creates freedom. Because so many are concerned about losing their freedom, right? But when we create structure around public lands and how important they are for this nation as a national interest, and bring patriotic pride to that, I think we can make some gains.
Fantastic. That's all of the time we have. In fact, we're already a minute over time. So I want to thank our panelists. It's important for me to acknowledge that there were a number of questions that were very specific to racial and ethnic diversity and equity. In particular, audience members were questioning whether your organizations are doing things to increase minority leadership there. So just something to think about. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us. Thank you to our tremendous audience. Many hundreds of people joined us today for this fantastic talk. Dr. Jody Hilty, Jamie Williams, Jim Enote, and Senator Udall. Thank you for your perspectives on this, and I can't wait to keep the conversation going. We'll leave you all with that and see you next time.